1948 didn't just redraw borders. It changed the rules. Before this moment, the land was shaped by empires, administration, and distant authority. After 1948, it entered the modern international system, where survival depends on institutions, force, and the ability to hold territory. This is where history stops being imperial and becomes existential. One state emerges with centralized power, military organization, and international recognition. Another people emerge without sovereignty, fragmented across borders drawn by war rather than agreement. From this point forward, the conflict is no longer about who once ruled the land, but about who can survive within it. This video is not about moral verdicts or political slogans. It's about what happens when modern states are born unevenly. Do you accept the cost? Subscribe to the channel. This is where power, history, and technology are examined without comfort. By 1947, the imperial system that had governed the territory for centuries was no longer capable of sustaining itself. The British Mandate, created as a temporary administrative solution after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, had reached its limits. What it was managing was not a stable province, but an unresolved inheritance. Unlike earlier empires, Britain did not rule with the expectation of permanence. The Mandate was designed to administer a transition, yet it never resolved what that transition would lead to. Competing promises, incompatible political projects, and rising violence made continued governance increasingly costly and unsustainable. When Britain announced its withdrawal, it did not transfer sovereignty to a local authority. It exited. This distinction is crucial. Power was not handed over. It disappeared. The end of the Mandate created a vacuum. Administrative structures collapsed faster than political consensus could form. Security fractured. Competing armed groups moved to fill the gap left by imperial authority. In this moment, the territory ceased to be governed and became contested. The United Nations attempted to replace imperial control with an international solution. The 1947 partition plan was not the continuation of empire by other means. It was an effort to prevent chaos by imposing a political framework from the outside. It proposed borders, institutions, and statehood where none had previously existed. But plans do not govern territory. Power does. The proposed partition was accepted by one side and rejected by the other. More importantly, it lacked an enforcement mechanism capable of stabilizing the transition. Without an imperial army to impose order, the plan remained aspirational rather than operational. Violence escalated before any state formally emerged. As British forces withdrew, local and regional actors acted according to their own interests. What followed was not a clean shift from administration to sovereignty, but a rapid descent into armed confrontation. The territory fragmented into zones of control rather than coherent political units. This moment marks a fundamental break with the past. For centuries, the land had been ruled by distant empires that maintained order through administrative continuity and force. In 1947-48, that system ended without a replacement strong enough to immediately stabilize what followed. History shows that when empire exits without a successor, conflict is not an anomaly. It is the default outcome. The collapse of imperial authority transformed political claims into existential struggles. Questions that had once been theoretical, borders, sovereignty, control, became matters of survival. This was not the beginning of the conflict, but it was the moment when history stopped being administrative and became irreversible. From this point forward, the territory would no longer be shaped by distant empires, but by modern political actors competing to establish and maintain a state. The imperial age had ended. What replaced it would be decided by force, organization, and the ability to endure what came next. The War of 1948 did not simply create a new state. It exposed the structural imbalance that had been forming long before the first shots were fired. When the British withdrew, two national projects confronted the same moment of collapse with very different levels of preparedness. On one side, the Jewish community in the territory had spent decades building institutions under imperial rule, political representation, administrative capacity, armed organization, and international diplomacy. These structures were not improvised in wartime. They already existed and were activated when the mandate ended. On the other side, the Arab Palestinian population entered the same moment without a centralized state apparatus. This distinction matters more than ideology. For centuries, the land had been governed externally. Local Arab society was organized around villages, extended families, religious institutions, and regional elites, not around a unified national government capable of asserting sovereignty. When empire exited, there was no single Palestinian authority able to claim territory, enforce borders, or represent the population as a state. War accelerated this imbalance. As fighting spread in 1948, Israel declared independence and immediately consolidated control through existing institutions and command structures. At the same time, neighboring Arab states intervened militarily. Rather than enabling the creation of a Palestinian state, their involvement fragmented the territory further. Gaza fell under Egyptian administration. The West Bank was annexed by Jordan. Palestinian political agency was displaced by regional power dynamics. The result was not a bilateral war producing two states, but a multilateral conflict producing one. Borders were not defined by mutual agreement, but by ceasefire and armistice lines. These lines were temporary by design, reflecting military positions rather than recognized sovereignty. What emerged was a state with defined institutions facing a population without territorial control. Displacement followed this asymmetry. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were uprooted during the war. In the modern international system, displacement becomes enduring when no sovereign authority exists to absorb refugees, negotiate return, or secure citizenship. Without a state, Palestinians entered the post-war order not as a political unit, but as a humanitarian problem administered by others. This is the core of the birth without a state. It was not the erasure of identity, nor the absence of population. It was the absence of sovereignty at the decisive moment, when sovereignty was being distributed. One side crossed the threshold into statehood. The other was divided between external control, military administration, and exile. This produced a lasting imbalance. Israel emerged from the war with a monopoly on force within its territory and recognition within the international system. Palestinians emerged without borders, without a government, and without a unified authority capable of negotiating on equal terms. From this point forward, the conflict would no longer revolve solely around territory, but around asymmetrical power. Borders would remain unstable because they were never finalized. Negotiations would be unequal because only one side entered them as a state. This was not a moral outcome. It was a structural one. The War of 1948 did not just create a conflict, it locked in an uneven starting position that continues to shape everything that followed. After 1948, the conflict entered a new phase. What had begun as a struggle emerging from imperial collapse evolved into a series of wars between states. The central axis of confrontation shifted from local communities to regional power. For Israel, the period between 1948 and 1973 was defined by a single overriding objective: survival. The new state faced immediate hostility from neighboring Arab countries that rejected its existence and sought to reverse the outcome of the war. Security doctrine, military readiness, and territorial defense became foundational elements of state building. For Palestinians, however, this phase unfolded without sovereign representation. Instead of becoming the core actors of the conflict, Palestinians were largely subsumed within broader Arab-Israeli wars. Their cause became embedded in regional strategies pursued by Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and others. While Palestinian identity remained central rhetorically, decision-making power rested elsewhere. This structural arrangement mattered. Arab states confronted Israel as states with armies, borders, and governments. Israel responded in kind. The conflict became interstate, governed by military doctrine, alliances, and deterrence. In this framework, Palestinians existed politically as a people, but not institutionally as a state. Wars in 1956, 1967, and 1973 reinforced this dynamic. Each conflict further integrated Israel into the logic of modern state warfare. Military victory translated into strategic depth, deterrence, and international recognition. Survival was no longer just a question of existence, but of maintaining favorable balances of power. At the same time, Palestinian political autonomy remained deferred. Territories associated with Palestinian populations were controlled by other states. Gaza remained under Egyptian administration, the West Bank under Jordanian control until 1967. Palestinians were mobilized symbolically, but not empowered structurally. This period demonstrates a key historical pattern. When a national cause is carried by states that do not intend to relinquish control, statehood is postponed indefinitely. The absence of Palestinian sovereignty was not only the result of Israeli power, but also of regional priorities. Arab regimes pursued their own security, legitimacy, and territorial interests. The Palestinian question functioned as both a rallying point and a bargaining tool within a broader geopolitical context. By 1973, the limits of this model were becoming clear. Repeated military confrontations failed to eliminate Israel. Regional exhaustion set in. The idea that the conflict could be resolved solely through interstate war began to erode. At the same time, Palestinians increasingly recognized that their political future could not be secured through proxy representation. This realization would reshape the conflict in the decades that followed. The period from 1948 to 1973 transformed the struggle from a post-imperial collapse into a regional power contest. Israel consolidated itself as a state through repeated wars. Palestinians remained without sovereignty, their fate tied to decisions made beyond their control. The asymmetry deepened, and with it, the conflict moved closer to its next structural shift, one where territory, occupation, and internal fragmentation would redefine the rules once again. This video is intended for historical and educational purposes only. It analyzes documented events and structural patterns, not moral judgments or political endorsements. By 1967, the conflict had shifted from a question of recognition to a question of survival through deterrence. Nearly 2 decades of regional hostility had convinced Israeli leadership that borders defined by armistice lines were not defensible in a conventional war. Geography itself had become a strategic vulnerability. The Six-Day War did not begin as a territorial project. It emerged from escalating military tensions, mobilization, and the perceived imminence of a regional attack. When the fighting ended, however, the strategic map of the region had been fundamentally altered. Israel now controlled the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. This acquisition transformed the meaning of territory. Before 1967, land had been contested symbolically and politically. After 1967, it became operational. Depth, elevation, and buffer zones replaced abstract borders. Territory was no longer viewed only as land to govern, but as space to prevent annihilation. This shift mattered because it changed the logic of the conflict. Holding territory became synonymous with security. Withdrawal became associated with risk. Military planners began to treat geography as a defensive system, one that could absorb attacks, delay advances, and provide strategic warning. For Israel, this reinforced a doctrine of deterrence through control. For Palestinians, the consequences were immediate and profound. The territories most closely associated with Palestinian populations came under direct Israeli military administration. What had previously been controlled by neighboring Arab states now fell under a single authority. This marked the beginning of a new phase, occupation as a structural condition rather than a temporary wartime outcome. The conflict moved inward. Instead of being primarily a regional interstate struggle, it became a confrontation embedded in daily life, checkpoints, permits, and military governance. Territory ceased to be an abstract issue debated by states and became a lived reality for civilians. Internationally, ambiguity replaced clarity. The post-1967 situation created unresolved categories: land captured in war but not annexed universally, populations governed without sovereignty, borders defined by control rather than agreement. Diplomatic language struggled to keep pace with facts on the ground. This is a critical turning point. Territory as security introduces a dilemma that persists to this day. Land held for defense becomes politically costly to relinquish. Security achieved through control generates resistance. Resistance reinforces security concerns. The cycle sustains itself. From this moment forward, the conflict is no longer primarily about whether Israel can survive. It is about how security, territory, and legitimacy can coexist within the same geographic space. 1967 did not resolve the conflict. It redefined it. By turning land into a defensive asset, the war transformed borders into front lines and geography into policy. The consequences of that transformation would shape every negotiation, uprising, and confrontation that followed. This was the moment when territory stopped being a prize of war and became the architecture of security. After 1967, the Palestinian question entered a new structural phase, one defined less by regional wars and more by internal fragmentation. The issue was no longer only the absence of a state, but the absence of a unified political space in which a state could emerge. Territorially, Palestinian society became divided into distinct and disconnected arenas. The West Bank and Gaza Strip, though often spoken of as a single entity, evolved under very different conditions. Geography, administration, and political control pulled them apart rather than binding them together. This fragmentation had concrete consequences. Without continuous territory, governance became uneven. Movement between Palestinian areas required external authorization. Economic systems developed asymmetrically. Local authorities operated under different constraints, producing divergent political cultures and priorities. At the institutional level, fragmentation deepened further. Palestinian political representation struggled to consolidate a monopoly over force, a foundational requirement of statehood in the modern international system. Multiple armed actors, competing leadership structures, and overlapping claims to authority prevented the emergence of a single, centralized government capable of enforcing decisions across all Palestinian territories. This was not merely a question of ideology, it was structural. States negotiate, defend borders, and administer populations through unified institutions. Fragmented political spaces, by contrast, generate parallel authorities that compete rather than consolidate. The result is weakened bargaining power and diminished capacity to translate national claims into sovereign reality. Meanwhile, Israel's control over borders, airspace, and movement reinforced this asymmetry. Security concerns led to layered systems of administration that further segmented Palestinian life. What began as temporary measures solidified into long-term structures. The conflict thus became internally uneven. Some Palestinian areas experienced limited self-administration, others remained under direct military control. Refugee populations outside the territory remained politically central but territorially disconnected. The Palestinian National Project existed across borders, but not within a single, governable state framework. This fragmentation reshaped the nature of resistance and negotiation alike. Without unified authority, negotiations lacked a single counterpart. Agreements made in one arena failed to translate into stability in another. Internal divisions weakened collective leverage, while external actors filled the gaps left by the absence of centralized control. Over time, fragmentation became self-reinforcing. Political division justified security measures deepened division. Each cycle reduced the space available for coherent state building. This is a critical pattern in modern conflicts. When territory, authority, and population do not align, sovereignty remains deferred. Identity alone does not produce a state. Control, coordination, and institutional unity do. By the late 20th century, the Palestinian condition was no longer defined solely by displacement or occupation, but by disconnection between territories, between institutions, and between political strategies. The result was a national movement caught between external constraint and internal division. This did not end the conflict. It changed its internal logic. From this point forward, any path toward resolution would have to confront not only the balance of power between Israelis and Palestinians, but the fragmented reality within which Palestinian political life now operated. Fragmentation had become a defining feature and a central obstacle of the conflict itself. By the present day, the conflict no longer resembles the imperial transitions that shaped the land for centuries. What exists now is the outcome of accumulated structural decisions, some deliberate, others imposed by circumstance, layered over time. One state is consolidated. The other remains incomplete. Israel today operates as a fully functional state within the modern international system. It maintains a centralized government, a monopoly over force, defined institutions, and the capacity to project power internally and externally. Its security doctrine, shaped by decades of conflict, prioritizes deterrence, control of territory, and rapid response to perceived threats. The Palestinian condition, by contrast, reflects the long-term consequences of deferred sovereignty. Palestinians exist as a people with identity, history, and political aspirations, but without a unified state framework capable of translating those elements into sovereign authority. Territory remains fragmented, governance remains divided, control over borders, movement, and security is external. This asymmetry is not accidental. It is the product of patterns visible throughout this video: the collapse of empire without a successor, the unequal emergence of state structures, the conversion of territory into a security asset, and the fragmentation of political space. Each stage reinforced the next. As a result, negotiations today do not occur between two equivalent actors. They occur between a state and a national movement, still struggling to consolidate the basic conditions of statehood. This imbalance shapes every discussion about borders, security, recognition, and legitimacy. Crucially, this does not mean the conflict is frozen. It means it is constrained. History shows that conflicts defined by asymmetrical power tend to persist not because they lack solutions, but because the structural incentives discourage resolution. Security achieved through control generates resistance. Resistance reinforces security measures. Fragmentation weakens negotiation. Weak negotiation prolongs fragmentation. The pattern sustains itself. What began as a question of territory under empire has become a test of modern state survival under permanent pressure. For Israel, the priority remains maintaining security in a hostile environment. For Palestinians, the challenge remains converting national identity into effective sovereignty under constraint. Neither side operates in a vacuum. Regional dynamics, international actors, and internal divisions continue to shape outcomes. But beneath these variables, the same structural logic persists. In the modern system, states endure through organization, control, and the ability to absorb cost. This does not resolve the conflict. It explains why it endures. Understanding these patterns does not assign blame, nor does it justify suffering. It provides a framework for interpreting why repeated attempts at resolution falter, when underlying structures remain unchanged. History in this case is not a guide to morality. It is a guide to constraint. Before 1948, this land was shaped by empires. After 1948, it became shaped by state survival. That shift changed everything. And it is within that shift from administration to endurance that the present moment still operates.